Ena mana, ena reo, ena iwi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings to you all and welcome to this event. On what does the security of New Zealand depend? What is our role as a community? I'm Joy Don-Sheath from the United Nations Association, and I welcome you to this session, and a welcome to our panellists, Tony Lynch, Richard Jackson, Gray Southern, and Raf Manji. He waka eke noa, which can be translated as a canoe which we are in, with no exceptions, or this is a situation where we're all in a boat together. He waka eke noa. The COVID-19 pandemic has made many of us acutely aware of how very dependent our lives and how we live them on the actions of others here and beyond our borders. We are questioning aspects of New Zealand's security that we once may have assumed were taken care of. Internationally, there is growing instability in major power relationships, uncertainty in the stability of many smaller nations, dependence on complex trading systems, and rampant technological developments. A highly interconnected world requires our increasing awareness and strengthening of human health, ecosystem functioning, community stability, and the viability of the biosphere itself. Now is a fertile time to reassess what security means for us as a community and as a nation. What threats are important and how can we best address them? What does this mean for how we see ourselves, our community values, our international standing, and our prosperity? This event is an initial exploration to stimulate thinking on some selected security questions within and beyond our shores. We have gathered four very different speakers to set the scene for audience discussion and feedback. Also, let us consider our topic in the context of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which the New Zealand government signed in 2015. Our relevant goal and targets are Goal 16, promote peace, promote just, peaceful and inclusive societies. And the relevant targets for us are 16.1, reduce all violence and related deaths. 1611, strengthen institutions to prevent violence and combat terrorism. And 17.17, promote effective public, private and civil society partnerships. Now, the program this evening, what we'll do is, following the four panellists' presentations, we'll go into Zoom breakout rooms for 15 minutes so that we can discuss in small groups what the panellists have said. Each group will select a recorder to write in their breakout chat 2 questions or comments from the group. Then all of us will rejoin the main Zoom room, and the panellists will respond to these questions, suggestions, and comments. In the small breakout groups, after panellists' presentations, you'll be asked to discuss the following. Now, listeners might like to make a note of these questions. First question: what question does your group wish to ask the panellists about their presentations? And the second question: what specific actions to strengthen New Zealand's security do you suggest that you can take individually and we can take as a community? These questions will be available on the chat. And we move on now to our panelists' presentations. They have approximately 18 minutes each. Our first speaker is Tony Lynch. Tony is an experienced diplomat who is now Deputy Chief Executive of the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, where the nation's security policy is based. He heads the National Security Group, and he will set out the official policy and how security is managed. Tony, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joy, and I trust everyone can hear and see me. Ena mana, ena reo, e ro rangatira ma tēnā koutou katoa. My thanks to the United Nations Association for the initiative of this panel discussion this evening, to Rosalind McIntosh, Joy, Grace Southern of UNA, and to my other fellow panelists. I'm delighted to join you for this important topic. And a special thanks to all the UN Association members and friends for joining us online tonight. As mentioned, I'm Tony Lynch, Deputy Chief Executive at DPMC, responsible for the National Security Group. Our Minister is the Minister of National Security and Intelligence, who in keeping with New Zealand's tradition is the Prime Minister. And this reflects the importance of national security for us and for any country, as well as reminding that national security touches virtually all aspects of daily life. And it only takes a Canterbury earthquake or a 15 March tragedy or the present COVID-19 crisis to reinforce this message about the reach of national security. I've been asked to talk about the government's policy, including how national security is managed in a New Zealand context. And I thought I'd start off first with New Zealand's definition of national security, and then for some reflections on our geostrategic environment, before turning to outline the system our country has in order to manage national security in this increasingly complex and challenging environment. Our definition of national security is incredibly broad by any standards. So from the National Security Handbook 2016, it is the condition allowing New Zealanders to go about their daily business confidently, free from fear, and able to make the most of opportunities to advance their way of life. And I'll come back to this a little later in reflecting what this means for community engagement and role. And in keeping with this expansive definition, we also take an all hazards, all risks approach to national security, an approach acknowledging both our size and capacity, as well as the unique nature of the threat environment we face here in New Zealand. To turn first to the global environment as the context for considering New Zealand's security. And given this setting this evening, who better to draw on than United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres in his recent Nelson Mandela lecture of 18 July. And the Secretary General talked of a world in turmoil, economies in freefall, that we've been brought to our knees by a microscopic virus, that the pandemic has demonstrated the fragility of our world. He states that the COVID pandemic has laid bare risks we have ignored for decades: inadequate health systems, gaps in social protection, structural inequalities, environmental degradation, the climate crisis. Entire regions that were making progress on eradicating poverty and narrowing inequality have been set back years in a matter of months. We face the deepest global recession since World War II and the broadest collapse in incomes since 1870. Antonio Guterres' theme in this lecture is reducing inequality, which he notes is at the heart of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, our agreed blueprint for peace and prosperity on a healthy planet. And as Joy had mentioned, New Zealand has, of course, signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. The Secretary General presents an extraordinary outlook. It is, of course, a rallying cry to the nations of the world at a time when the multilateral system is under pressure as never before. And these are indeed extraordinary times. The COVID-19 pandemic comes on top of what Antonio Guterres described in April as the highest level of geostrategic tensions in years, together with an epidemic of misinformation online, the existential threat of climate change, the shadow side of digital technology, mass movement of people, trade tensions, high levels of inequality and exclusion, breaches of international norms, increased military spending, and renewed nuclear competition. So how do we see all this from New Zealand, and what does it mean for us? The longer-term implications of COVID-19 on international peace and security are, of course, still unfolding. The COVID-19 is clearly presenting national security risks and challenges of a scope and magnitude not previously seen. What was already a complex and dynamic security environment, as aptly described by the Secretary-General, is being exacerbated by these new forces, impacting our values and interests. The threats we face have not gone away or dissipated, but in a number of cases are magnified or accelerated. All this is testing our nation and our national security system as never before. And to note that the challenges we face are only compounded for our Pacific Island partners. So a few words to outline the system. We have a set of national security objectives, 7 of these: ensuring public safety, preserving sovereignty and territorial integrity, protecting lines of communication, strengthening international order to promote security, sustaining economic prosperity, maintaining democratic institutions and national values, and protecting the natural environment. We also have 16 national security and intelligence priorities, outlining key areas of national security interest to the government. And these range from international governance, geopolitics and global security, to transnational organised crime, terrorism, Pacific regional security, biosecurity and human health, and to areas such as space, cyber and emerging technology. We have oversight of 42 nationally significant risks. Some of these natural, such as earthquakes, tsunamis, flood and drought, biosecurity risks such as foot and mouth disease, and of course pandemics, and then others man-made, whether people smuggling, terrorism, foreign interference, or espionage. This breadth reflects the all hazards, all risks approach we take, as already mentioned. Each of these risks has a nominated lead agency. And so, for example, health has an obvious example in leading the COVID-19 response, though in almost every case, engagement in managing these risks spans a range of agencies. This work is governed under ODESC, the Officials Committee for Domestic and External Security Coordination, which is chaired by DPMC's Chief Executive, Brooke Barrington. And under the ODESC structure, there are 2 governance boards, the Security Intelligence Board and the Hazards Risk Board, across which responsibilities for the 42 nationally significant risks lie. The treatment of these risks is guided by the 4 Rs, as we call them: reduction, readiness, response, and recovery. And when risks become issues or threaten so, the system responds, typically through the lead agency, but with scope where there is complexity or multiple dimensions for wider support through a watch group and an ODESC process, bringing together a range of agencies. What we don't have is a national security strategy, or at least not a strategy spelt out in the one document. It's a little like our Constitution in this regard. The various components I've just described collectively form the strategic approach we do take to national security. But if I were to suggest one issue for your breakout session, then I'd be most interested in your reflections on whether you saw value in New Zealand having a discrete national security strategy. So that's a snapshot of the system. It's not perfect by any means, but in recent years we've been regularly tested. Canterbury and the Kaikoura earthquakes, Pike River, the MV Rena, the tragedy of the terrorist attack of 15 March, Pakari, White Island, COVID-19, which remains with us today. And of course, many more local and national events that will have touched each and every one of you at some point. Increasingly, too, we are dealing with multiple events occurring concurrently. We learn from these and we build on the experience. The Royal Commission of Inquiry into the mosque attacks, now set to report on 26 November, will provide a further opportunity to improve and strengthen the system. So to take us back to the question posed for this panel, on what does the security of New Zealand depend and what is our role as a community? I'll repeat our definition of national security: the condition allowing New Zealanders to go about their daily business confidently, free from fear, and able to make the most of opportunities to advance their way of life. This is a holistic view, rather than perhaps the more traditional view of national security that other countries may hold, meaning the answer as to what securing this condition depends on is similarly and necessarily wide-ranging. It lies in our institutions, our systems and governance, including our democracy, our values, the rules-based order, and a functioning international system, our relationships, bilateral and regional, and I would emphasise having an inclusive and resilient society. And on this latter point, I would note that beyond New Zealand, people and communities are not always or necessarily considered part of the national security equation. Yet for New Zealand, when our communities participate, when people believe their actions count in outcomes, then this can have powerful impacts on national security. For example, community connection and commitment to social inclusion is crucial for mitigating violent extremism. For one of the strongest defences against terrorism is an inclusive, resilient society. So an inclusive, resilient society. Civic engagement is the bedrock of our democratic processes and institutions, while innovation is at the heart of our economic prosperity. Take our present situation, the COVID-19 pandemic. It has served to make national security both broader and more personal. The Team of 5 Million concept. In October 2019, a survey of global health security rated countries for their pandemic preparedness. New Zealand came out 35th out of 195 countries. Not bad, but not too good either. Just ahead of Greece, but behind the likes of Brazil, Italy, Indonesia. The US and the UK were first and second, respectively. The nature of our response when COVID-19 did arrive has been remarked on favourably by others, as you know. This is certainly not to declare success, and far from it. For as we saw, as is happening in Melbourne and Victoria, we could be only a few days away from a resurgence at any time. But my point is that in some areas of national security, we have great strengths to draw on, which can more than compensate for the financial or capability constraints we face as a small nation relative to others. One of these is flexibility and adaptability. We can move fast. We are small, but we make the most of that. We have strong relationships across the public sector. Our leaders know each other well, and we can have honest conversations about capacity and capability. And we have strong community engagement, the Team of 5 Million. It was not luck that helped to get us to the position we enjoy today, but through the systems, processes, and importantly, people in our communities. And so that is my argument, and in fact, my plea to all of you. Your continuing engagement is crucial to our national security. And as a final note, this extends to the importance of participation in an informed, robust public discourse on national security. So again, I'd like to thank and acknowledge the United Nations Association once more for this initiative. The more robust the debate around national security, the greater the engagement in this area across our communities, then I can say from an official perspective, the better the public policy outcomes we will be able to deliver. And so the better the national security outcomes we all can deliver. So I look forward to the contributions of my fellow panelists and to the breakout sessions and the Q&A to come. Thank you. Nau mai, hara mai. Thank you very much. And back to you, Joy.
Thank you, Tony. Our next speaker is Dr. Richard Jackman, who is the director of the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies in the University of Otago. He will discuss how the combined impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Black Lives Matter protests, rising economic inequality, and the climate change crisis made the orthodox security paradigm redundant. He will discuss how we might begin to rethink our notions of national security, including the idea of replacing national military forces with social defence. Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much. Many thanks to you all for giving up your evening to be here for this important conversation, and thanks to the UN Association for inviting me. Kia ora tātou and rangi Māori e kia koutou. Peace to you all. As Joy mentioned, the thrust of my talk is going to be that in the spirit of trying to provoke a debate about key issues, that we're currently facing four major interlocking crises, which will inevitably force changes to our way of life, force changes to the condition that allows us to pursue our daily lives and our daily business. And these current crises render our current and the world's really current security paradigm, I think, largely irrelevant, anachronistic, and in some ways dangerous. And so we need to rethink from the bottom up how we're going to do security and how we're going to conceive of security. I mean, one of the most important things will be how can we think of security in terms of the inevitable social upheaval that we're going to face as we try to adapt to the climate change emergency, as well as change the nature of our entire economic system. So briefly, I just want to talk about the four key crises, and I don't need to spend a lot of time because I'm sure that you're all completely up to date with the news where these things are talked about all the time. Obviously, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. I think the important point to note here is that a UN report recently warned us that zoonotic diseases, that those are diseases that pass from animals to humans, are part of our current food production systems and our relationship to nature. So this is very unlikely to be the last pandemic of this kind that we're going to see. But as we all know, it's affected the entire world and really thrown everything up into the air. The second key crisis is the global rise in consciousness about the ongoing effects of racism and social injustice. And what we've seen here is that in almost every country around the world, there has burst into consciousness and burst into the political scene an awareness that our current way of life, our current system, our current international order is fundamentally racist. And if you combine that with the disproportionate effect that the pandemic is having on people of color, then you can see that there is what I call a social justice crisis that is being driven by global awareness of the racism inherent in the current system. The third crisis is the wealth inequality and economic recession crisis. For many, many years now, we've known that global inequality is rising and continues to rise to unprecedented levels. Published research by Oxfam last year showed that the richest 1% have now more wealth than the rest of the world combined. Global network of tax havens enables the richest individuals to hide $7.6 trillion. Dangerous, poorly paid work for the many is supporting the extreme wealth for the few. Women are in the worst work, and almost all the super rich are men. And this inequality is going to be greatly enhanced and is already being enhanced by the pandemic and its economic effects. We know from other research, Wilkinson and Pickett's famous study called The Spirit Level, that wealth inequality is associated with a whole series of terrible social outcomes, including lower life expectancy, higher infant mortality, homicides, mental illness, higher rates of imprisonment, and so on. Things that really make people insecure in society. New Zealand has also gone from being one of the most equal of the developed or wealthy countries to one of the least over the last 2 decades. And, you know, this also has impacts. The fourth crisis is the climate change crisis. And many of you will have seen yesterday's report on the projected impacts of the climate crisis in New Zealand. And I don't need to rehearse any of the data from that, but clearly we are headed for a major temperature rise between 2 and 4 degrees, and this is going to have huge consequences in terms of rising sea levels and coastal flooding, increase in extreme and destructive weather events, health impacts caused by the spread of viruses, bacteria, and so on, destruction of marine ecosystems, mass extinction. About 1 million species are currently at risk of extinction in the coming crisis, groundwater problems, disruption to food supplies. I mean, the climate crisis is already having devastating effects on many societies. There are millions of so-called climate change refugees, and about 5 million people die each year from air pollution, hunger, and disease as a result of climate change. Now, it's important to recognize that all these crises are intertwined and have a compounding effect on each other. Climate change effects fall disproportionately on the poor and people of color. The pandemic and its effects are disproportionately being experienced by people of color and the poor, and climate change will exacerbate inequality, while inequality is also fueling climate change. Now, some might say that the pandemic and some of these crises are sort of unique one-off events, and we're likely at some point in the future to go back to some kind of normality. But I think there's reasons to think that this is actually not the case. And that's because there are some compounding issues here. First of all, virtually all of these crises are rooted in systems, in our existing systems. They're internal to our social organization rather than external to it. And in many ways, they're driven by capitalism, our current system for organizing production and the maintenance of life in society. As George Monbiot puts it, and I quote here, "The economic system is incompatible with the survival of life on Earth. Capitalism's failures arise from its defining elements, the requirement of perpetual growth. Economic growth is the aggregate effect of the quest to accumulate capital and extract profit. Capitalism collapses without growth, yet perpetual growth on a finite planet leads inexorably to environmental calamity." Other reports as well note that, 1 million species are at risk, and only a wide-ranging transformation of the global economic and financial system could pull ecosystems back from this brink. Similarly, we could argue that the food production system, especially based on animal exploitation, is in large part responsible for the rise of viruses such as COVID-19. The UN report I mentioned last month warns that more diseases that pass from animals to humans, such as COVID-19, are likely to emerge as habitats are ravaged by wildlife exploitation, unsustainable farming practices, and climate change. The science is clear that if we keep exploiting wildlife and destroying our ecosystems, then we can expect to see a steady stream of these diseases jumping from animals to humans in the years ahead. Another compounding issue is the challenge of the institutional and resource capacity of our societies to make the adaptive changes that we will need to deal with these interlocking crises. What we've seen over the last few decades, and something that's coming to the fore as we try to deal with COVID, is that there's been a massive defunding and hollowing out of the very public institutions which we now know are essential to managing these kinds of crises. This is part and parcel of the transfer of wealth to the super rich through tax breaks and tax avoidance regulations, the privatization of public services, and other measures driven by free market principles and the neoliberal ideology. So the 2019 Oxfam report says, and I quote, "The growing gap between rich and poor is undermining the fight against poverty, damaging local economies, and fueling public anger across the globe. The report reveals how governments are exacerbating inequality by, on the one hand, underfunding public services, such as healthcare and education, while on the other, undertaxing corporations and the wealthy, and failing to clamp down on tax avoidance." Now, what this, I think, does is it creates an adaptive capacity gap. The amount of adaptation we are going to require to deal with these interlocking crises far outstrips the institutional and material resource capabilities we currently have. Another compounding issue is that our political institutions and systems are not well equipped to deal with these crises through things like the short-termism inherent in the electoral cycle, the zero-sum game of electoral competition, the lack of broad representation in Parliament, the status quo conservatism of ministries, ties between business and politics, and so on. All of these things create inertia into the system and make transforming, particularly in radical ways, the status quo extremely difficult. There are vested interests tied into maintaining the current system, which works to the advantage of those at the top of the economic system. A major study, the Princeton study, demonstrated in the United States, for example, that the general public has little or no independent effect on policy making, whilst economic elites have a quite substantial, highly significant and independent impact on policy. And this is true across a lot of the world. So my argument really is that we've got a very complex situation. We've got a situation where massive change is coming one way or the other. And what I would argue is that the current paradigm that we've inherited for security comes primarily from the Cold War and before that from World War II. And it's based on classical strategic thinking and what I call a violence paradigm, a paradigm where security is seen to come through the possession of weapons, military force, or alliances with those powerful military forces who might protect you. And at the same time, it's based on a logic of preserving the current order and preserving the current status quo. I mean, that's what the word security means, to make secure something, to protect what it is. And the problem with that is that we're in a current period of change, where change is inevitable. So we have to rethink security. And what I'd like to argue is that we're at a moment where I think it would be worth having a radical rethink about the way in which we conceptualize security. So in some ways, I'm arguing that the traditional traditional military-based security model is no longer that relevant as we go into trying to deal with these connected crises. So looking at the world at this very moment, for example, just to give you an example, it's telling that many of the countries most badly affected by the virus, the United States, the UK, France, Russia, and so on, are also the countries that have put the most resources and efforts into traditional national militaries and having nuclear arsenals, large and powerful militaries, vast military industrial complexes, and these countries dominate global military spending. But none of this has protected their people, their economies, or their way of life from the pandemic, for example. So in order to meet the coming challenges of this new situation, I'm arguing that we need to jettison previous ways of working and adopt a new paradigm which involves new assumptions, new values, new ways of working, and new tools and approaches of security. And this new security paradigm will probably need to include the following points. First of all, I think we will need to rethink what the object of security is. Traditionally, it focuses on the nation state, but I think we may need to rethink that to the planet and the people. In other words, what good will securing New Zealand from the pandemic be if the rest of the world continues to be engulfed by the pandemic? Health professionals have argued the ability of a country to defend itself from a pandemic is only as strong as the world's weakest public health care systems. Now, the same may be true. The same is true as well for things like rising sea levels due to climate change. I think we also need to rethink the objectives of security policy, from preserving our current way of life and protecting the status quo, maintaining the existing order, to one of managing social transformation and building resilience, defined as the ability to cope with shocks and disruptions and change our way of life without causing harm. I think we need to rethink the means of security, from coercive and deterrent power to collective cooperative power, and from the imperative of monitoring and surveillance to the building of trust and social capital, from military forces to social defense, for example, from armed peacekeepers to unarmed peacekeepers. I think we also need to rethink security spending, from weapon systems and military preparedness to health systems, climate adaptation, and social justice. A recent comment by the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons states, "A virus doesn't care how many nuclear weapons your country has. Every dime wasted on nuclear weapons could be better spent giving citizens a fighting chance against COVID-19. This also applies to most military weapons. New Zealand spends many millions per week on the NZDF. I think we also need to rethink the actors of security, from centralized elite-led bodies with extensive powers to empowered local actors and citizens. Again, this brings out the idea of social defense rather than national defense. And then I think we need to rethink the assumptions and attitudes of security. It's going to require the adoption, when appropriate, of new attitudes and assumptions based not on continuously searching for threats, such as viewing activists or protesters as potential threats, as we sometimes have in the past, but building relationships and trust with the community and working together with those who are trying to bring about social and environmental justice, working with people and communities on common issues of security. In other words, I think moving towards the adoption of a human security, environmental security kind of approach over a national security approach. And I want to end with a couple of comments from Alan Beam from the Australia Institute in a recent Guardian article. He expresses some of these points when he writes, and I quote, "People around the world no longer feel safe, nor are they confident that their governments can keep them safe. For the individual citizen, security now has more to do with managing a global pandemic, mitigating and adapting to climate change, preserving clean water, maintaining reliable food supplies, and protecting individual and community well-being than with supporting the ability of the state to protect its sovereignty against threats from other states. If we are to deal with the disruption that now characterize the global economic, climate, health, and political environments, it's imperative that we rethink the foundations of national security policy. Traditional security thinking fails to deal with the new security issues presented by global warming and now pandemics. These constitute existential threats to human security that are not amenable to solution by military forces. The scope of national security policy needs to transcend traditional defense and law enforcement models." And then he goes on to argue that security policy needs to resolve a set of binaries. First, the relationship between the citizen and the state needs to be redefined, especially in a world where more people want protection from the state rather than protection by it. Second, we need to move from the reactive planning dynamic that focuses on threats and risks to a proactive dynamic that builds harmony, inclusion, resilience, tranquility, and well-being. A dynamic that deals with threats not as things to be defeated, but as things to be prevented. Third, we need to replace the control mindset that addresses people's problems for them with an empowerment approach that enables individuals and communities to take charge of their own lives and prospects. Less enforcement and more encouragement. And fourth, it is important that the intervention model of public policy design is tempered by a prevention model that emphasizes prudent preemption rather than dramatic reaction. And I just want to end with the comment that the current moment is actually an optimistic one, because if it's one thing that we've seen from the global pandemic, it is that it has put paid to the idea that significant transformative policies are impossible and that there are not the resources for major projects aimed at the public good. It has, in other words, expanded the range of the politically possible. It's no longer the case that politicians can say, well, we can't reorient our security approach. We can't spend billions on on climate change mitigation. We've actually reached a moment where we've shown that almost anything is politically possible if we put our minds to it, even rethinking our traditional established security paradigm. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. Our next speaker is Dr. Gray Southern. Gray is a long-standing member of the United Nations Association and president of the Tauranga branch. He has studied issues of security and community perspectives for decades. He will explore how our community often views security and factors that support those views. He will also outline the potential for a more constructive security through greater community engagement. Gray.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fiora. I want to explore some ideas about how we as a community can see national security and how we can contribute. I hope to relate them to your own views and develop something better in the discussion. Let me share my screen. Okay. At the risk of some, oh wait a minute, I've got to, yes. At the risk of some oversimplifying, I will outline two principal ways that we see security. They're going to be a little bit different to what we've been hearing so far, but I hope they can contribute. They're based on two very different views of the world, and I call them paradigms because they actually consist of sets of ideas, of a worldview, of a type of threat, the techniques and skills required, the institutions, and the legitimacy, or why we believe these particular paradigms. The first paradigm is that the world is an antagonistic jungle with threats from malign foreign powers. We need to combat them with our military, and this view is legitimated extensively by our history and culture. I call that the combat paradigm. The second paradigm is about nations engaging to address many common challenges. They negotiate, cooperate through diplomacy, associations, and this is legitimated by law and relationships. So look at the combat legitimacy. As I say, is deeply embedded in our history and culture. History is replete with wars and battles which have largely established the nations we now have. We have armies, and we celebrate or commemorate our battles. Museums display the areas, the schools train the discipline, the news covers a lot of military activities. We have our grand stories that captivate us. We have the video games, which many of our youth and sometimes adults are involved in. We've got fantastic, amazing technologies and absolutely incredible levels of power. And the future is developing with flexible nuclear weapons, better biological weapons, cyber warfare, autonomous weapons, space warfare, etc. So you see, there are many powerful signals that tell us that combat is the name of the game in international security. It is exciting, at the same time threatening, and a major factor in the world scene. For many people, that is what security is all about. Second paradigm, legal and relationships. We do have agreements made through history, but not all that many of them. The Treaty of Waitangi actually took a century before it became effectively recognized. We've got the United Nations General Assembly, the peak of our cooperative process. But it's grand, but rather remote for most of us. Security Council, reputedly largely frozen by its veto. The schools have model UNs, but they're great fun, but just voluntarily organized. But most cooperation is represented by riveting scenes such as this. So I want to put it to you that the cooperate paradigm presents a very light footprint on society. There are few novels, movies, or games about international cooperation. The media explains it very poorly. You know, when all the world's nations agreed on a comprehensive framework for global development, the world's media virtually ignored it. That was just 5 years ago with the Sustainable Development Goals. However, international cooperation and agreements provide a foundation for most of our civilizations, such as trade, for our travel, our international finance, our management of the oceans, our climate change agreements, and many, many other things. In fact, international cooperation gives us the means of addressing a host of issues that are crucial to our way of life, for most of which combat has little to contribute. Just two of these items, the pandemic and climate change, is dominating our lives just now. So cooperation has an amazing potential to address the complex of threats that we face. The global problems require global solution, which require a whole nearly 200 countries to work together. So I'll summarize it, say cooperation has limited history, little culture, it's often confusing and boring, seen as undermining sovereignty, and the general assessment now is it's under stress, exacerbated by the pandemic. You know, that is a worry. But it's still the basis of much of our society. So we've got these two paradigms, combat and the cooperative, sitting side by side. Now, most countries pursue both. In fact, all countries, all but 20 countries, invest in combat by maintaining standing armies. And all participate in the cooperative paradigm by talking to each other and belonging to the UN. So, is it reasonable to assume that somehow these two very contrasting systems fit together? But how? How can countries negotiate in good faith when they depend on destructive power for their security? To what extent does the fear and distrust from the combat paradigm undermine cooperation? It seems that this is happening in the West Pacific right now, and a number of other places. And international distrust has also undermined our collective response to the pandemic. So we've got a real problem there. Now, where does New Zealand fit? New Zealand, from my reading, has got fairly nice position. It's got a reputation of being independent, doesn't have enemies, doesn't threaten anyone, good at building relationships, good at bringing nations together, and generally a good international player. It also has a combat capability. So I was wondering, conjecture, would it be possible to make such strong relationships around the world that no country would want to attack us? Well, let's think of that a little bit. Let's think about how countries relate. We normally focus on heads of state and the way they engage, but we know that underneath all this is a lot of diplomats. But the military also have a diplomatic role, and the academics have a lot of exchange between each other. Then there's trade. Important not only for what we trade, but also how we do business with each other. And there are all sorts of associations, particularly friendship associations, but other associations where we share between countries. Tourism also provides understanding. And the migrant communities, which I think could be quite special. Take, for instance, countries that we're really close to, like Australia and the UK. In many ways, we're bound together by our migrant communities. I have 2 sons and their families in Australia. We have better ways of solving our problems than fighting. New Zealand has migrant communities from many other countries. How much can they enhance our international understanding? So we've got all these process. This sharing is currently happening in bits and pieces, and much isn't in silos. What if we started sharing between those silos, or sharing more than we do? And so there's a lot of exchange between different types of people about really what is happening around the world and how we can relate to other countries. It may require some considerable transparency, I guess, to get all this working together. A few months ago, I went to a Chinese Friendship Society talk by people doing business with China. I found it quite amazing the way they operated. We have so much to learn. So there are enormous opportunities in intensifying our engagement with other countries. And my interpretation is that this is really quite consistent with our foreign policy. In fact, I was fascinating to find that MFAT has a China-capable public sector program where the public sector is being trained to deal with China. Now that is interesting. So, which countries do we want to do all this work with? Well, I think we've got to think beyond the like-minded countries to all that are important to us, especially those who have any chance of becoming enemies. We need to be have the ability to deal with all countries, even those with rather different values to what we have, even values which we have a lot of problems with. We've still got to deal with them. And how do we do this? Well, we've got to have a major, concerted, well-funded program engaging all relevant activities, education, various range of seminars, workshops, with deep, respectful sharing. We all have problems, we all can learn. Creative approaches to sensitive issues towards open, inclusive understanding. So, why would we do that? Well, I'll put it to you, to make us a much better, exciting, prosperous and attractive country, and a much safer one. But there's more. Good relationships mean easier cooperation, a much more successful United Nations and its system, and a comprehensive constructive global security. But let's take a reality check. Can this work? Many will say that it's crazy to ignore military threats. New Zealand can't stand alone, but New Zealand does have many friends, and good relationships trump combat solutions anytime. We can be leaders. And the community, where does the community fit in? We could be involved in many phases of this program and provide many challenging and exciting activities and many new jobs. But we do need to know much more about other countries and how we work with them. Be very creative about how we can contribute to the many complex issues around. Engage with key players to develop better solutions. And there are many opportunities for moving in this direction right now. So in conclusion, my summary is that our history and culture tell us that combat is the name of the security game. Our real world challenges, as we heard before, and the possibilities that tell us that cooperation is a better bet. And we, the community, have much to contribute. So, join the United Nations or any number of other organizations which are contributing to this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Gray. And our final speaker is Raf Manji. He is a former Christchurch City Councillor and currently a strategy and risk consultant with a background in global finance. He will speak as a prominent member of the Christchurch community, deeply involved in the city's recent crisis and their aftermath, and look at how national security issues impact local communities. Over to you, Raf.
Thanks, Joy. Tēnā koutou katoa. The great thing about going last after such excellent speakers is that, one, you get to repeat what they've already said, but also pick out the good bits. So thanks very much, gents, for your comments, which are extremely interesting. I'm going to try and talk about what I see is the community piece in national security. But I'm going to start, as I tend to do, with a very global macro picture, and then sort of try and bring it down to what it looks like on the ground. So I'm going to talk about the big societal shifts that I think we've seen over the last 20 years, probably last 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. I think Richard talked about some of these issues, and the economic trends that have caused ultimately the hollowing out of communities, and in some ways providing a bed for violent extremism to take hold. So I'll talk a bit about the CVE issues, which obviously we've had our share in Christchurch, and then look at actually what does it mean to build strong communities, because it's not as straightforward as it sounds, and I can reflect on my time as a Christchurch city councillor. The impacts from COVID-19, which I think are salutary, the general global pressures, which obviously Tony talked about a lot. And then perhaps, what does a new approach to security look like without forgetting the realist actions of, the big global players that, are still playing the same game they've already played for many, many years. So I was thinking where to start this, and I went back to an article that was written just a week after the terror attack in Christchurch. And I'd done a lot of interviews that week, a lot of international media. And then I did an interview with Luke Malpass, who was at the Australian Financial Review at the time. And now he's back as, I think, Stuff's political editor. And we spoke for an hour about, what had happened to the community and thoughts about various things. And then I started talking to him about the financial issues as I saw them. And he got quite interested in this because it was a slightly different angle. And I sort of, suggested a hypothesis that the global financial crisis had contributed quite a lot to the economic dislocation that we'd seen globally. And therefore, as I said before, a potential bed from which extremist behavior could rise. And he was quite interested in that. And I thought, I certainly hold that view that the socioeconomic piece is as important for national security as the political piece was, certainly in previous years, certainly back in the 70s. So I'm going to start there and get you to start thinking about the financial and economic piece in national security, because we don't tend to think about it when that subject comes up. So the societal shifts, 2008 and the global financial crisis, it had huge impacts. Not so much in New Zealand, but we certainly saw the finance sector go under in terms of the secondary lending institutions. And what we saw was a response which was primarily targeted at what we call, say, Wall Street, the banks supporting the financial system, huge amounts of liquidity. And we're kind of seeing the same thing now. And I actually wrote a piece for Interest just after the COVID crisis broke out, called Good QE or Bad QE. And we're sort of kind of doing a little bit of a mixture at the moment, where essentially the markets are flooded with liquidity so that the financial markets can keep doing what they're doing, as opposed to trying to deal with the problem at hand, which is usually a social dysfunction or a social dislocation, certainly in the labor markets. And so what we've seen in the last 10, 15 years is a real focus on Wall Street as opposed to Main Street. And this has quite major implications, not just obviously in the US and the major markets, but also all around the world, in some of the developing countries and some of those second tier countries as well, especially where you have large younger demographics and populations. And this ultimately is a battle between capital and labor. And I think, again, Richard might have talked about this in terms of that neoliberal paradigm, but the forces of capital seem to be winning because they're much more mobile and they're much cleverer at moving around and finding a place to go, whereas labor is basically people and they're not so mobile and it's not that easy for them to move about. But it has profound social implications. And this has led, and we've seen again in recent years, to what I call a hollowing out. We had this slightly in the 80s. New Zealand certainly experienced it, but a kind of a deindustrialization, outsourcing of labor to cheaper labor countries, leaving behind what they call in the US, the Rust Belt, rusted communities. We had it with the mining communities in the UK back in the 80s, and to some extent, traditional communities here in New Zealand, farming, forestry, and a way of life which sort of just disappeared overnight. And that leaves big holes. It leaves big social holes. And whilst that doesn't necessarily create a security issue, it certainly lays the seeds for major dysfunction and ultimately a lot of very unhappy men, usually, and particularly young men. And we saw, of course, in the 2016 election in the US, this categorization of Trump supporters as deplorables, and in some respect expendables, and they didn't really sort of matter. And people took it as if it was a evidence-based policy decision, but actually it was people just saying, we're not happy. Everyone's forgotten about us, and this guy's saying he's going to take care of us, so we're going to vote for him. But what it also engendered, and what we've seen in the US, is the rise in right-wing groups, white supremacists, and a lot of people driven by economic dissatisfaction. I mean, that's where a lot of the recruitment comes from. And that's something, I think, where the socioeconomic piece falls over into the security piece. And you can put that across the Middle East, across South Asia. A lot of the areas where we're dealing with traditional security issues are from areas where there are poor social and community outcomes. So CVE, which has become, a popular acronym, countering violent extremism. How do we deal with this? How do we deal with the young men who are easy to recruit, easy to embed that sense of being left behind? It's not as political as it was. I mean, yes, obviously ISIS is being very political, but we're starting to see more socially driven outcomes, and people who are actually attacking really the economic system as much as the political system. I mean, in the 70s, a lot of terrorism was politically dominated, the Marxist-Leninists, the Red Brigades, the Baader-Meinhofs. These days, we're seeing very different approaches, and we're seeing the recruiting grounds not always coming from what we think of as religious or political backgrounds, but also social backgrounds as well. Young men are severely at risk, and we saw that obviously in Christchurch, and we've seen it overseas, particularly in Europe in recent years. In 2019, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, issued a mayoral report on CVE. Leanne Dalziel, the Mayor of Christchurch, and I were lucky enough to go and visit him in London last year. I was both there for other matters, but we caught up with him and talked about the report, which he literally just published. And it was very, very clear in all the work they'd done that the roots of what they saw radicalization and extremism was in ultimately communities which were not performing. Council estates, high unemployment, no facilities, no funding for community activities. And, what came out of that was the need to build community resilience, develop pathways for young men, especially coming out of school, which we've seen here a little bit in New Zealand in terms of not in education or training. Identity issues with a huge immigrant and second generation immigrant population trying to understand where they fit in to society. And without strong communities, even, places to go and play sport or just hang out, there's a sense of disaffection. And once you take away any sense of purpose or future, it's very easy to fall into either crime, and then obviously through crime, access also into, deeper and more disturbing areas. A lot of young men spending time on the internet as well and being radicalized there. So that, that really set off the alarm bells, and everyone is quite concerned about it. And what it shows actually that what we always understood as national security and terrorism in terms of being political issues are very much now rooted in a more basic level at the socioeconomic space. And it doesn't mean that obviously the international stuff doesn't happen, of course it does. But in terms of what impacts us in our own countries, this is quite important. So building strong communities, this is kind of what we're supposed to do at the council level, at the local government level. And this was very strong in that report, and it's something that every council in the country tries to do. But one of the problems we have, and this is a risk that I think is not just particular to New Zealand, but I think it's quite exacerbated here because of our small population, but quite unstructured institutions, in that we have a central government, and we then have 77 councils delivering, serving a population of 5 million. And it's quite difficult sometimes to know who's supposed to be doing what. And I'll give you an example. Recently, last week, there was an announcement, and it might have been this week, announcement for a new youth hub in central Christchurch, which I'd been calling for some time, which is great. And it's being delivered and funded by central government. Obviously, the money will go to the local group. And you could sort of say, well, actually, that's something that local government should be doing, but local government doesn't always have enough funding. So we kind of get this little crisscross between who's actually driving the strengthening communities bit, and are there too many hands in the pot? And that creates some issues. It's also the same with, I've put immigration policy because it's quite important, and it's certainly something I've had to deal a lot with over the last year working with the victims of the mosque attacks, is that immigration actually has been the number one issue for that community. It's a very ethnically diverse community. A lot of them have struggled with residency issues, bringing family here as well, and there are still some outstanding issues there. But the whole idea of immigration without the economic and social support piece behind it creates a lot of problems. And I'm seeing, a lot of young men who are struggling to get work, who are facing discrimination, and are really a high-risk group for all of us, especially given what happened to their community. And so we've tried to do some work around that, but it's extremely complex. And when we're looking at risks, yes, there are definitely risks there, and there have been some young men that have been quite difficult to deal with. And I think when we think about immigration, we often look at it through a skills-based policy or education policy or whatever, and not actually what's going to happen to these people when they come to New Zealand. I mean, how do we deal with integration and assimilation? It's not just something that you can write about or talk about. It actually takes quite a lot of work. And it's something that takes many people a very, very long time. People move for all kinds of reasons. We have refugees, we have economic migrants, we have family migration. But the art of settling down in a new country takes, often generations for people. So I think sometimes even with the refugee program, which I've worked on here, we bring people here, but we don't always provide the support that they need. And I think the attack in Christchurch has certainly brought out some of those issues, and I think it's something that we need to deal with. So being inclusive and welcoming is important, and that's something that people can do. That's something that communities can do. Obviously, things like community facilities, youth clubs, youth hubs, getting people out of their houses, that's a big opportunity. So another thing I've noticed in terms of COVID-19, and this fits into the immigration piece, is like, who is a citizen? We've seen all the arguments around border control, and I'm sure Tony's well involved in some of that stuff, but it's actually a very tricky problem. And you even see, you see how people have felt overseas about it. And this kind of concept of actually, well, what does it mean to be a New Zealand citizen? And actually, who is a citizen? And then who is a resident? And there's all these different categories of people, and it's very, very difficult. But it shows that the they are us and the them or us is quite problematic. And I think that has implications for how we build our communities in the future, and how we look at something like a social contract. And I was quite interested, I think, Richard, in what you were talking about in terms of social defence. I think that's a very interesting idea that I've been looking at for a while. And actually, how do we build good citizens, and what does that look like? I've talked about supply chains there. Obviously that is a national security risk, which feeds into that kind of local versus global production. We know the global pressures. Tony talked about them. They're all there. The biohazards is the pandemic, and there's probably worse to come. We're actually in a very good position in New Zealand because we're an island a long way away from anywhere else. And we got lucky with COVID because of that, because it gave us a lot of time. But we know there's a lot of challenges. And I think we need to really think long and hard about how we're going to deal with some of these, because they're not going to go away. I guess the themes around reframing national security, which everyone has talked about a little bit, is that how do we shift to, I say James Bond to Citizen Bond. Obviously, as Tony would say, it's not all James Bond. But the sense that it's not just kind of fighting the Russians and the Chinese and all the rest of it. It's actually, what do we do in our own country? How can we all be part of building a secure country? And security is actually being able to walk down the street and not think you're going to get attacked, to feel comfortable with where you are within your community, being active in your community, having neighbours that you can call on, having a sense of sharing a sense of values, understanding your rights and duties as a citizen. We do a lot on the rights. We don't do a huge amount on the duties. And I think the idea of creating some kind of, national civic service program, I think is certainly worth looking at. Will that, when you look at places like Switzerland or Sweden, they have very, very strong community engagement with each other. And I think a lot of that is to do with the way that they approach some of those issues. The risks between local and central government, that's an institutional problem. And I think we actually have a lot of institutional problems in New Zealand because we're just over-governed. We've just got, the complexity of our governance arrangements is crazy. But it's not just a kind of a financial efficiency issue. It actually creates some security risks because you can get into situations where you don't know who's in charge of what. And we saw a little bit of that in the hospital sector, in the COVID response. Who's in charge of PPE? Some hospitals trying to get PPE from outside the country on their own, so things like that I think need to be looked at. And we do need to think about this long-term or long descent into a very challenging decade, at least. Climate change, water issues, all of these have security implications as well. So to conclude, we have seen major global structural shifts, particularly in the socioeconomic space, globalization. It's had huge impacts on people's communities. That is a problem. When people get angry, they are open to doing all kinds of things. They're open to be radicalized, but not just in a political way, in a social and economic way as well. The rise of populism, we saw it with the start of, say, the Tea Party, Brexit, and look at where we are now. Look at the mess that we have in Europe. Look at the mess that we have in the United States. These are problematic and they create security problems. When you see what is going on in the streets in the US, it's terrible stuff. But it started off with really what was quite a populist economic sentiment. So the risks are increasing. I think we need to refocus our national security lens. Obviously our lens nationally, as Tony said, is pretty broad. But we need to look at it, I think, through that community perspective and how we build stronger communities and how we build inclusive communities as well, because we want people to feel like they belong. And that takes a bit of work. And then finally, this idea of reconstituting the citizen. What does it mean to be a local citizen in New Zealand, as well as having a global outlook, which is something that Kiwis do very well. But I think we need to do it better in our own backyard. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raf. And thank you to our 4 speakers. We're now moving into breakout rooms, approximately around about 6 to 10 people, to discuss for 15 minutes our responses to these 2 questions. And I'll just repeat those 2 questions, although they will be written on your screen on the chat. Here they are. Question 1, what questions does your group wish to ask the panelists about their presentations? And the second question, what specific actions to strengthen New Zealand's security do you suggest that you take individually and we can take as community? And just a few recommendations. When you get to your breakout rooms, please turn on your video so that you can see each other. Would the group please quickly select a reporter to write the group's 2 questions or comments on your breakout room chat as you talk. At the start, please ensure that each person is in turn given time to answer the questions uninterrupted while the others in the group listen carefully. And finally, then in the general group discussion that follows, look for underlying values and points in others' comments where you can agree, even if you don't like everything that was said. We are now in breakout rooms.
What was said before, and why don't we make use of these fabulous and fantastic human rights, sustainable development goals for us to become truly inclusive, transformational, and through the sustainable development goals. Any thoughts on that?
It's really interesting why the Sustainable Development Goals have taken such a long time to get up. I think there's, for some reason, they're not very sexy. We just don't have a culture that has got the patience to understand what all this extraordinary range of different issues is about and how they relate to each other. I'm not sure whether it comes from our entertainment or violence is much more interesting than solving problems. And high-level political leadership really is an issue in making things important.
Yeah, but I hear what you're saying. But the Sustainable Development Goals are to be implemented locally. So hearing what Raf said before, maybe local government. That's where they naturally should reside.
Mm-hmm.
There they could really take them and run with it, and actually they could really become the bridge that solves a lot of the issues that are here. Raf Manji discussing before. Maybe it is time for civil society and local government to come together and under the wings of the Sustainable Development Goals and do the things the way that we want them to be. That will be much more powerful than waiting for government top-down directions. That could be an option to think of for us, maybe to discuss further.
Can I say something?
Look, do you want me to jump in on that one?
I'd like to say something, if I may.
Yeah.
Have your chance with the whole group.
Yes.
We are planning citizens' assemblies to work with local government, where representatives and people who don't usually get heard politically come together and talk with each other and come up with very clear requests to local government. Before that happens, we need the local government to act on what the citizens say or give very good reasons why not. And we can see that this is a very powerful way to join citizens together, get them talking, get them understanding each other on local issues at a local level. The other thing that's happening is mindfulness in schools, and for the children, that's a really important process to learn on how to deal with conflict, how to deal with your own emotions, how to deal with people who are difficult in a way that heals. So I'll leave it at that. Mm-hmm.
Through actually one of the UN charitable trusts I chair, we funded Bead and Proceed, which is the social enterprise promoting the Sustainable Development Goals, and they're doing a great job in promoting and raising awareness. The big problem for local government, and I alluded to it a little bit, is that the structures are not right. So if you look at the purpose of local government, it is to deliver, obviously enable democratic participation and deliver good quality public services and infrastructure. And, they're funded by the good old ratepayers. Now, a lot of ratepayers see council's role as the roads, the rubbish, and all the rest of it. And it waxes and wanes. So in 2002, it also included the four well-beings. Then national government took it out, and then the Labour government put it back in. But also the purpose of central government is the four well-being. So I have seen firsthand a confusion over funding and who's going to deliver what. Now, I completely agree, Barbara, and Rosin, that those citizens' assemblies, participatory budgeting, all good. The problem, I think, is the funding stream, is that people, and we went through this with the earthquake, so many community groups came up with great ideas, great ways of doing things, and it kind of died a death in the council graveyard, like many good ideas, because it didn't have someone who could say, we're going to do this and here's the money. And then when central government is over the top and then occasionally comes in with big amounts of funding to do community level things, people get really confused and can't work out, well, who's funding this stuff? So I think central government which likes to interfere when it wants, and it needs to be really clear about its relationship with local government. And we have the same thing in the UK, in the US, all over Europe. So I think if we can get that clarified and say local government deals with community issues and central government doesn't, that might make things a little bit easier, because people will think, I can go to my local representative or I can vote for someone and it makes a difference. At the moment, people, voter turnout less than 40% for local elections because people don't really think it makes a difference. And that's a real problem, given that local government does spend quite a bit of money. But central government holds all the funding, and that's a big problem. And it's, and as I've said to national security people, it's a big risk for the country.
Sure, thank you very much. And Barbara, absolutely agree. And I mean, government has signed up to the goals. Of course, they're aspirational. There are the challenges of putting them into effect, as Rafe has talked to at all levels. But in terms of that political commitment, absolutely, that is there. And I think the wider discussion that we've had is about New Zealand, how communities can engage and be involved, and the question is to what end, to what effect. Well, in the sustainable goals, we have objectives and direction that's spelled out at a multilateral level. We're supporting our neighbours in the Pacific and elsewhere in terms of their efforts to attain those goals, and the track record is pretty mixed. So the challenges both within our own communities to be able to lift and work towards those goals, as well as the support in our neighbourhood. And one message I would deliver is a secure neighbourhood, Pacific partners that are able to look after themselves, that are able to build and sustain their own inclusive, resilient societies, are very much in New Zealand's own interests, and particularly given that close reach between the communities we have scattered all through New Zealand, with there's familial ties around the region. So it's a challenge for us, but it's a challenge more widely, and certainly to emphasise that from a central government perspective, that commitment is there. Of course, it's the challenge of putting that into effect. So again, that's a great discussion to keep having. So thank you. And very good point.
And thank you, Tony. Richard, do you have?
Well, I just agree. I mean, as a good anarchist, I think that all communities need to work for their own empowerment and their own self-rule and autonomy, and I believe that they should. Unfortunately, we've got a political culture built up over a long time of dependency on government, and people just think if the government isn't going to fix it, well, it won't be fixed. But really, we need to create an empowered citizenry that says, well, look, we don't actually need the government because we have the resources, intellectual and material, within our own communities to fix our own problems. The problem is that we're in a political culture where that sort of thing could be seen as rebellion, and it could be seen as something scary because governments then wouldn't have complete control over everyone. And so there's a tension. And then I think the other tension is that we've got an economic system that produces inequality. Capitalism is a bad system. It produces regular crises, and it produces deprived communities. And you can have nice institutions where everyone gets a voice, but if the economy is impoverishing people continuously and destroying the environment because it's based on perpetual growth, these things are going to be in tension. They're going to be in real contradiction. And then you get situations like the Black Lives Matter movement where a moment of rupture and anger comes because the institutions are not able to deal with the material conditions of people's lives who are being harmed by the system. And so the system has to transform. But one of the things I was trying to say in my talk a little bit was that we need to rethink our paradigm away from top-down searching for threats and trying to fix them, to bottom-up empowerment and transformation of our way of life, so that we're dealing with threats before they arise. And that includes the threats that are all coming and are all coalescing because our current economic system produces them.
From Peter Nichols, what role can women have on the world security stage? How can women get into those substantive roles? Well, particularly, both of those questions, but we could separate them out, but I think we'll leave them together. So from our panelists, do raise your hand if you'd like to speak. And Raf's got his hand up first. So Raf.
Thanks for that question, Peter. Hey, look, two things. I've just finished, a role on the Trade for All Advisory Board, looking at all aspects of New Zealand's trade. And one of the recommendations we made to the government, to MFAT, was to have more women involved in trade delegations and trade negotiations. And the government was very positive about that. So it's simply about, bums on seats. It's getting women into the roles and getting them involved with that security lens, because, they do have a different view. And I think, in a way, moving away from James Bond to Citizen Bond, and actually think security has a much bigger picture. Can I, talking about the SDGs, can I feed my kids? Is a big security problem, because if you can't, the knock-on effects are huge. So I think it's really just about promoting them. Having said that, if you read or listen to Samantha Power, some of her experiences as ambassador to the UN, she might have a slightly different view. But it's, I think it's the security lens, the way we think about security, that I think means we need to have more women and just a more diverse representative engagement.
And I can add to that MFAT has prepared a paper on trade and gender, which I have read, and this will be, no doubt, presented and available soon. So there are strong moves in that direction. Shall I? I think we might perhaps go on to the next question, unless other panelists would like to make a response to that. And I don't see any hands up, so we'll go to our next question. Would New Zealand be more secure if we were more self-sufficient and independent, particularly keeping out of other people's wars? Now, from our panelists, any hands up? That's our panelists. Unless I can't, I've got all the panelists on the screen. Raf again, and I will say that, and I can see Gray with his hand up, and I will say Richard and Tony, please, if you have raised your hands, I haven't seen it. So over to Raf.
Okay, just a quick one, because I want the others to participate as well. Look, I think an autarky is probably not a good idea. And what we saw during COVID was the importance of those global supply chains to get products in, especially through Singapore. And it sounds like a great idea, but so was the 70s. And, I think we have benefited from open markets and the importance of trade in ideas as well as goods and services. So I think, yes, we want to be as self-sufficient as possible, because that is a national security issue. We don't tend to involve ourselves in other people's wars. We tend to be more from a kind of, peacekeeping perspective. And I think we just need to keep promoting that.
Other panelists? Gray, thank you.
I would certainly support keeping out of other people's wars, but I would not. I don't think self-sufficiency is an ideal goal, except in certain circumstances, because we are a collective. We're a global collective, and we've got to work together. And to work together to address those issues which cause the wars is a real thing. We can't do that by ourselves. We must work with other countries. For instance, look at Taiwan. How is Taiwan going to work out? How can we make some sort of contribution to helping people thinking more constructively about that relationship between Taiwan and China?
Thank you, Gray. Richard.
If I could just make a dissenting voice here, I think one of the things we have to really look at, particularly in terms of the climate crisis, is the perversities of the global trading system and the way it distorts economies and the way it destroys environments. So we've seen in New Zealand, for example, the environmental impact of the vast increase in dairying based on our global trade in there, and the way in which we destroy our own waterways and our own quality of life in the search for profits on the global market. Many other countries have perverse situations where, for example, people can't afford to buy tomatoes grown in Ghana because cheaper tomatoes are flown in from Italy under unfair trading agreements. You know, all the different products that gets, you know, from coffee to rice to palm oil and so on that destroy local environments, but because of the way the international economic system is, forces people into those kinds of choices. You know, we have to completely rethink our economic system, and that includes reliance on these big global corporations and unfair trading practices and profit-driven practices that are willing to destroy the environment. At the same time, I'd also add that I think if we completely disarmed New Zealand and got rid of our military, we would be no threat to anyone. So that would actually help with our security, and we could do unarmed peacekeeping to meet our international goals at the same time.
I did see a hand from, just a moment, I saw a hand from someone who's not on the panel. These questions are for the panel to answer, and if we have time at the end, anyone who's taking part in the event will be able to ask another question, but at the moment these questions are for our panel to answer. The next one on our... Oh, thank you, Tony. To Tony now. Yeah.
If I may, thank you. Just a comment on the question around self-sufficiency and involvement in others' wars. Just a point that if we had wanted to be truly self-sufficient, we wouldn't be having this debate now, because we wouldn't have the technology to be able to exchange these views. So, you know, part of what trade does allow us to do is to have the lifestyle, have the access to a global world. You'll know New Zealand produces enough to feed about 85 million people. We're 5 million people. This is our contribution to the world, as well as to the lifestyles that we enjoy. In terms of other people's wars, and you know, the proposition presumably is to sort of keep our heads down in the small isolated part of the world. But we've always been a part of the world. We've always been committed to the multilateral system. The UN Charter is very clear. Peacekeeping is one of the critical functions that the United Nations is involved in, and we have a long and proud tradition of contributing to global order, to supporting the rules-based system, whether that's in trade, whether that's in the security domain. And it's, you know, those are decisions that have been taken over many, many years in New Zealand's interests. You know, in the end, it's around a definition of what is in New Zealand's interests. And I would absolutely put the proposition that global peace and security, as talked about by the Secretary General, and the ability to trade and prosper, to have economic prosperity, is absolutely critical.
Thank you. I'll move on to a question from Beryl Anderson. Need to deal with all countries, even if we have problems with their values. How do we work through that without imposing our values? And again, from our panel. Thank you, Raf.
I think I'd probably take the John Rawls approach here. I mean, you have to deal with illiberal societies. It's just the way the world is. And you do that by talking, and you do that by trading and trying to stay open, even though you may, you know, have an internally judgmental view, and you try and show by example. I mean, if we look at how many countries have changed let's say, since the UN Charter and the UN Declaration of Human Rights, where there was a lot of pushback from some of the more liberal countries, especially with respect to gender rights. They've come a long way. And I think, you know, and it even refers to the following question, I think talking is better and engaging is better rather than trying to kind of force people to change at the point of a gun.
And our other panelists? Gray, thank you.
I think we're not very realistic sometimes about the values we share with some of our closest partners. And I would think particularly of the United States and China, and also as presenting values which are very challenging for us. Yet we're locked in so intimately with the economic system. So yes, we're doing it now, and we've done it in the past, and we keep doing it.
Thank you. I'll move on to another question, and apologies if I'm just trying to pick out some. I note that Peter Nichols would like to express a view, and there are a number of questions from him. So I'll go to his question on community, increase civil society debate and a more substantive increase education on those matters. And at the same time, if you'd like to give a very brief comment, you've asked to give. Thank you, Peter.
Oh, first of all, in relation to the earlier comments, it wasn't just mine. It was a kind of a team effort from our breakout session, hence those comments. But I just wanted to, if I may, just comment briefly on armed and unarmed, because there's been some views expressed on that. Having deployed both on peacekeeping in an unarmed environment or deployed without arms and deployed on another one with arms, I would simply say that it depends on the political and threat environment, and what if that necessitates arms, then so be it. Because some of those deployments that New Zealand soldiers go on are undoubtedly dangerous. And we might think of the likes of East Timor and other places where New Zealand soldiers, unfortunately in a peacekeeping role or nation building role, have been in firefights. So unfortunately, that's the reality. And perhaps just on that, I'll just briefly conclude with a delightful comment by Brigadier Roger Mortlock when he was being interviewed prior to going to Bougainville and asked if he was going armed because of the security situation. And he said, yes, we are going armed with guitars. And that has to be a profound New Zealand way of singing to your opponents or potential opponents to reduce the levels of risk.
Thank you, Peter. I'll move on to one last question. How does the rules-based system work when major players like the US refuse to honour them? Should New Zealand stand by? This may be our last question because we're almost running out of time. So who'd like to have a go at that one? Thank you, Richard.
Well, the first thing I should say is that there's actually a lot of debate within academia right now about the global order and how it used to be a liberal global order that is now under great threat from things like the rise of populism, the sort of bellicosity of Russia, the conflict between China and the United States, and the decline in the number of democracies around the world and so on. But other people are arguing that, in actual fact, if we look at the so-called liberal order that's been in place for the last, several decades, it's actually a racist order in which mostly the European former colonial powers dominate the international system. They dominate economic development. They dominate trade. They dominate all the institutions of global governance. They have veto power in most of those major institutions. And they spend a lot of time fighting wars to protect their own interests, to protect regimes that they're in bed with, and to protect access to economic resources that they need to maintain their economies at a higher rate than everyone else. And that international order is a fundamentally unjust and racist one that grew out of imperialism and colonialism. And it does really need to change. And so I think, we have to rethink from how do we strengthen and preserve and get back to the great international order that perhaps we had at the end of the Cold War, or I don't know what point in history you want to think that we had a great international order. But instead of thinking that, think about how we might transform the international order into something that's far more just, that's racially just, that's environmentally just, that's economically just, and that gives recognition to the different political voices, the different political cultures, the different historical experiences of people and countries around the world.
Thank you.
We have to try and think about how we might get there.
Thank you, Richard. I have the 2-minute, well, it's now less than that time. Unfortunately, I have to wrap up this session, and so we'll have to conclude our event at that point. Thank you very much to our panelists and to the United Nations Association staff who helped organise this event, with a special thank you to Dr. Rosalind McIntosh and to Dr. Grace Southern. This year is the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and we'd love you to check out our website, www.unanz.org.nz. We thank our listeners for their rich and interesting contributions. And just to finish, if you'd like to join me, e hara e te mea, no anai e taro, no na tupuna, toku iho, toku iho. Thank you very much for your participation. Po Marie. Good night all.